Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so this is really great to have everybody here. We're going to wait just a couple minutes before we actually get started, but informal chatter would be good. Let me introduce our team of contestants here. Mike Land is the city manager of Coppell, Texas. And Vicki is one of the members of the city management team. Tracy is the other. And the three of them operate in vernacular that we would understand pretty much as a self-directed team. Is that a pretty good statement, Michael?
That would be an accurate and correct statement.
And how would you define that, the way that you work together with each other?
Three musketeers, one for all and all for one.
We keep Mike in line.
Hey, rhubarb.
Uh-oh, Eric Nicholson just arrived by the announcement of the dog. You know, one of the things that I remember, hello, Eric.
Hey, sorry, I've got a puppy I'm dealing with. I'll be right back.
Okay, great.
Hey, there's Craig. There's Craig. Hey, Craig.
Yes, yes.
How you doing?
McGee is here.
I'm doing well, Stu. Yep.
Good.
Looking forward to your daughter moving up here, though.
Yeah,
She's still trying to do that?
End of the year.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm sorry, guys. We probably shouldn't talk. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
One of the things that impressed me when I first got to meet Mike and Vicki and Tracy is that they told me that our expectation is that we are interchangeable to the whole staff, that we all will be informed on every issue and every aspect of the city government. And so somebody in the city could come and ask any one of us a question and they would get a very similar, if not the same answer. And is that, am I reflecting that?
No, knowing that I gave you the short and sweet answer, yes, that's absolutely true. When we created, when I became city manager, prior to that, I served as deputy city manager, and there were two of us, and we reported to the city manager, and we had assigned departments that reported to each of us. And so if something was going on in the other department, while we may be somewhat familiar, we wouldn't necessarily be intimately familiar, and that would create some inefficiencies. So when I became city manager, I said I wanted to try this and see how it goes. And at first it was a little uncomfortable for the department directors because they were looking for someone to report to directly. And then they finally got really comfortable with the idea that if something pops, if any one of us is available, whoever they talk to, they know that we are having communications on a regular basis every day. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And that whatever answer Tracy or Vicki gives is just like they got the answer from me.
So Vicki and Tracy, how is that transition to that style of governing where you had, in essence, a broader responsibility as a member of the CMO office?
Well, for me, it was a little challenging at first because I came in as a DCM from a library director role. So I had a lot to learn. I still do. But the communication piece has been really the most important part of that, and making sure that we communicate with each other, because when we do talk to a director and we make a decision, we need to make sure we're sharing that with each other and just keeping the doors open.
In Vicki's role, when I became city manager in April of 2017, so Vicki was a deputy director. There weren't the two deputy city managers positions. Tracy got hired and started in September, and another individual. And then basically about a year and a half later, that person left and is now the city manager in Brownsville, Texas. Yeah. And Vicki got moved over. So she actually experienced it as a director who had this changed on her, and then being in the position of being the deputy city manager. And then Tracy came out of a traditional city management as far as the way it was set up. So Tracy, maybe you want to talk about the challenges for you.
Yeah, well, in fact, it was nice because you do tend to get blinders in a traditional reporting structure where if it's happening in a department that's not yours, I mean, not that you don't care about what's happening over there, but it's not in that immediate sphere of, I need to know what's happening. And so it really gives you blinders and an ignorance about what's happening organization wide that that's not beneficial. It's not productive. And so this has been really nice, particularly as a new person coming in, because then I had exposure to everybody. It wasn't as if I only had this group of directors that I was forming a relationship with when I came in. It was an opportunity then to really get a broad perspective of what people were working on, and get a feel for how they like to work and all of those things in terms of forming relationships that I think were really important just kind of right out of the gate. It wasn't even a transition where we started with reporting directors and then moved away from that. It was just right out of the gate. Here's all of them. You're welcome.
You know, and Peter, the benefit of that is that we all know what's happening in different departments. So if we hear something that's going on in one department that might connect with another, it enables us to really communicate that with each other so that the communication increases across the whole board, across the organization. So we can help each other be better by, you know, identifying where issues that are affecting one department might also affect another department. And it helps us better across the organization.
How interdependent are the departments? In other words, do they rely on each other to get the work done?
Yes.
I'll let those two answer the question and I'll give an answer.
Yeah, I think there's a really high level of interdependence and cooperation. I know we've worked really hard to eliminate departmental silos. And so from an organizational perspective, we encourage that kind of intermingling and sharing of resources and helping each other out. So yeah, I would say there's a pretty high level of that sort of activity occurring.
I would agree. There's a lot of communication that goes on between departments now that did not used to go on. And it, like I said, it just really makes for being better across the organization and being more efficient in many ways. When we have a project that's going on that might impact, say, a new facility, at least we're communicating so that we know what's happening, and we can make sure that everybody is aware of those things, because one department, let's say ES, needs to know what's happening in that area so they can put the resources that are needed towards that project. So it's just improved our efficiency a lot.
And the other thing I would say to you is that, again, I hate using the word I. But anyway, coming on board as a city manager, we did two things right off the bat. We suck at project management. And so we sent a lot of our team members through project management and getting their certifications. And then the other thing we did is we went with ProSci on organizational change management. And all of our, I'd say probably close to, I don't know, 30 to 40 of our employees
40 now.
are certified in OCM. And so the question of independence, we've institutionalized OCM to the point now where it's just an expected part of our doing business. And so the whole stakeholder examination and who ought to be in the room, who ought to be having the conversations. Now, we're human, so we still make mistakes. So don't let me, give you an illusion that we're perfect. But the fact that we've institutionalized them and we've disciplined ourselves, it's again, much of the conversation we'll have a little bit later, it's getting more ingrained in our DNA because it's just what's expected, right? It's not even a question. It's, yes, this is what we do. And so when people come to us, from outside the organization that join the team, that's one of the things that we hear about is like, we're so purposeful in everything that we do.
Stu, I feel that was our first litmus test to pass to see if you got a similar answer from all three of us.
Did we pass?
It's been interesting. The last event that we had together was where we had 5 marketing experts come in and meet with all of the directors and I guess all of their direct reports. I don't remember exactly what the reporting was. We had 30 plus members there of the team. We had 5 recognized marketing experts from the DFW area, and we had wide-ranging discussions that were very productive. And Mike was sick. And so Tracy and Vicky were just running the show. And so for me, that was kind of a litmus test example of me being able to kind of sit back and watch this whole thing and say, they really do this. I mean, they talk about it when I'm in my discussions with them, but I got to see that they really did operate in that interchangeability way. And what I saw, Vicki and Tracy, was that everybody kind of respects you guys. There's nobody whining for Mike. Nothing personal, Mike.
No, they run. They don't whine. They run for Mike.
So it was, I saw some really profound evidence of that. Well, let's go ahead and get officially started. This has been a fun warm-up discussion, but let me share a couple things with you if I can figure out how to manage my cursor on this strange situation. Okay, so I wanted to share with you this. Our 2021 workshops that we've got organized thus far. We don't have dates assigned, but one is Peter Lazis and his spouse, Marie Rudin. Peter has been a member and kind of friend of the roundtable for many years. Marie is his wife, and she is a psychiatrist. And they have written a book together called From the Ground Up, talking about how frontline staff can actually save America's healthcare. It's going to be a great session where they talk about some of the key findings in their book. And they've had some very high participation interventions that they've done in various healthcare organizations. So I think it's going to be an exciting one for all of us. Then the online collaboration tools, we had a session on this. Irina and Yagoda did this earlier in the year, this year. And there's a need for us to do it again. People have asked us about it. And what we're also finding as we use Miro and Mural more and more, we're finding that there are some very important practices on how to use them and use them well. And so we're going to give them an opportunity to highlight that. We think that's probably 2 sessions, but we're not sure. And then right now we're working on organizing the organization design in a digital age that Paul and Stu and myself, we did that in July with Cocoon Pro, primarily aimed at a European audience. We're going to do that again. Yagoda is going to join us in designing and delivery of that. Cocoon Pro will be a sponsoring organization, as will the Roundtable, and we're hoping that we can get confirmation from EODF that they'll be a co-sponsoring organization. So that'll go down sometime January, February, March. We haven't gotten the dates tied down, but we're really excited about that. There's one more thing in the wings, a session on diversity, equity, and inclusion from a woman whom I don't personally know in England that's just publishing a book on that, and Yagoda is working with her to see if we can't get that agenda. Okay, so that's kind of the announcements section of the show. Are there any announcements that y'all, oh, Raghu Kaushik just joined us. Raghu is a friend and colleague and client of mine from California, a deep expert in digital, and he's a cherished friend. We've known each other for, well, probably, I think, Raghu, we met in 1992 when we were both working at Boeing. And I don't think
Yes.
I highlighted Eric. Eric has been a longtime friend and colleague in the Roundtable, worked for many years with the UFW, United Farm Workers, has worked in a very powerful capacity as the chairman of the board and board member with the Equitable Food Initiative. And now, congratulations, Eric, you're on your own as a consultant.
Thanks, Peter. I made sure not to listen to the advice you gave on that wonderful IMC training about don't do this, run away. So far, so good, but it's great to see everybody.
Yeah, we a bunch of us did a session for the Institute of Management Consultants on how to start a consulting firm, and And my most profound contribution was, don't do it. It's a fool's errand. So I guess it's good that Eric didn't listen to me. And Paul Tolchinsky just joined us too a couple minutes ago, and Bert Painter, delighted to have you here too. This is a great group, great discussion. I'm excited about where this ends up going. I guess in terms of ground rules, it's like, we've got the chat open, so if you want to ask questions in the chat, that's good. Stu gave the example of asking a question directly to the group. So we've got slides to go through, but we want to also have discussion. We're thinking 20, 30 minutes in terms of the slide and the presentation of that, and then into a more open discussion area. But that doesn't mean you can't throw some questions on the table as we're going through. We want this to be a bit of a freewheeling open exchange, and we are our online workshops, the theology, the philosophy that we have is that we're here co-creating knowledge, and that we come as peers, everybody bringing knowledge, expertise to the table, education, and so forth. And we all want to leave here stronger in our thinking than when we arrived. So let's make sure we do that. So I'll go ahead and put up the slide deck, and and let's get started with that. I'll cover the first couple slides. This slide is really oriented towards making the point that in designing organizations, we have to think about the individual, the human, the team, the organization, and then up into the ecosystem of societies and global environments, and that we need to have activities of designing each of these levels of the organization. And oh, by the way, one of the things that Bert and Carolyn and Doug Ostrom brought to the table most recently in their presentation in two online workshops was that the way a lot of us are doing that these days is designing the forums and deliberations, the places and the times when we actually get together to do collective thinking. And so that's a major part of what we need to design, is the interactions and the collisions between people that help us to govern the organization and get things done. I've been quite concerned over the last 9 months, 10 months with the COVID here. We've got some humongous issues that we've got to grapple with. The COVID is certainly one of them, the pandemic and the impact it's had in forcing much of our work to go into the distant virtual realm. We've got problems in terms of race, problems in terms of the role of women in our society, the imbalance between income and asset that we have between people. We've got the potential of economic collapse that kind of lurks around us. And for a lot of organizations and people, that's not theoretical, because a lot of organizations have gone out of business and a lot of people have lost their jobs and their means of income. And so this notion of economic collapse, we can look at as an organizational issue and an individual and family issue. It's not just a broad societal issue. And then cyber terrorism. We continue to see cyber threats. I was in a Zoom meeting not too long ago where we got Zoom bombed by some folks from Russia, and it made a mess of our meeting because we didn't have the right protections in it. And we formed a team to now ensure that we know how to handle this better and make sure that we have the security settings on Zoom. And so the cyber terrorism is not just people getting into your bank account, but now this new virtual world that we've created for interacting. There are whole new hygiene practices that we need to develop in terms of dealing with that cyber presence we have. Now, along with that, one of the things that I'm very hopeful about is that we do have ways of doing business well with each other. So for instance, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals lift some really good high standards for us to be able to think about in designing our organizations. And I had an opportunity to have a couple hours of Zoomish meeting with people from Berenson. One of my cousins is a general manager of one of their plants. We met with him and their corporate sustainable development person. And what they explained to me was how they are using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as an architecture for them designing their business strategy and their operational strategy and their strategic and operating plans. And so there are some ways for us to figure out how to design organizations so that they function well. That's one evidence of it. Now, one of the things that that we have had numerous discussions around amongst us is that we are not just addressing the issues of for-profit companies, but we also have the not-for-profit sector, which is huge, and the public sector, the government sector, which we're talking about today. We're talking about this as the setting for a whole new set of organization design issues. Not necessarily totally and distinctively different from other organizations, but having some unique characteristics. And so we in the roundtable and all of our affiliated friends at ODF and EODF and so forth, we all need to be thinking about all of the different kinds of organizations that we need to work on designs with. And then we had this balanced optimization model that Stu and Susan Morman and a couple of others did in one of their papers. And when I started my consulting with the Coppell city management team, this is one of the models that we used to be able to help them think about. And one of the things I want to congratulate them for is that they read the papers. And there were probably a half a dozen fairly thick papers on organization design, and they did not wimp out. They jumped right in, they read the papers, and then they figured out how to apply it to their work. So I'm very impressed with the work that the city of Coppell has done over the last several years, and I've had the privilege of working with them for a couple of years. And so we're at the point where we need to talk about that in some more specific detail. So Mike, could you talk about this key concept slide?
You're on mute.
Thank you, Peter. Just to go back on the balance optimization model real quick. What we found through the readings and the discussions was it was the first time we could actually put words to the way we were doing business. We didn't know we were using balanced optimization and I'll say its purest sense. But as we studied more and more about it, we realized that, and in fact, that's what we were doing. And I guess in a way, it kind of lifted some weight off our shoulders. It's like, okay, now this starts to actually make sense, but in a different way, right? So the idea of, Peter, you want to go back to that slide again? On the models, our journey has been long. This did not happen overnight. And it goes back into the late 1990s with the city management team working on the idea of, we were in silos back in the day. And we knew that that wasn't going to work because the city of Coppell was growing and it was growing quickly. Just for context, we are the front door of DFW Airport. And so literally from my door to a terminal is 10 minutes. So our location just dictated our growth. And if that growth was going to happen in a systematic way, they need to be able to have a relationship with each other. So the culture became extremely important. And that became the overriding thing. And so we started with things like Stephen Covey's, 7 Habits, and Jim Collins and, Good to Great. And then we started doing some other things to build the culture. And Vicky, what year did you come to Coppell? In 2008?
2009.
Okay, 2009.
Yep.
So in that time, we started working specifically on our culture and the idea of developing these competencies. And so the team came together and developed a technical, human, and conceptual competencies, which then started guiding what then became the Coppell's 4 C's, cultivating Coppell's culture. And so that started guiding us as well. And then as we continue to advance as far as our culture is concerned, and this kind of goes to some of the stuff we started doing later, we got into Lencioni's work. And I would tell you that Lencioni's work is probably one of the kind of foundational things we use for discussion purposes. And we picked up the advantage and started working on the 6 questions there. We had developed through the culture our hedgehog building community through public service. And we just kept building on this idea of our culture. And we also our hiring processes were such that we were taking executive achiever and other personality type tests and using that, and our major hiring decisions were made through team interviews. So they were involved in that, and we were constantly looking for the fit, so we believed in developing a healthy organization. Fast forward, so we continue to work on that. And one of the things, just from a vocabulary standpoint, is when you start building on that and layers and layers and layers, you don't want to confuse your organization. And so we wanted to make sure that we were using the same language over and over again, that idea of communications. And we had an opportunity to attend, Peter, again, I forget, that work session. It came out of a First Friday book club, and y'all put that together, and we were over at a hotel.
Yes.
And Peter laid out on the table. I don't know who else was with you, Peter. I just don't remember. I remember you.
Yeah.
But I remember on the table the fishnet. Yeah. And the idea of, today these are the kinds of things that are important, but in a few weeks or whatever, this makes me something that's important, right? So I'm simplifying all this. And so the light went off, I think, on several of us. It's like, that's what we do on a daily basis. So how do we make that? How do we institutionalize that? How do we build that into our organization? And so if you've read McChrystal's book, while you can agree and disagree and all those kind of things, it was really fascinating. But the idea of the team of teams and how that works, and that's really how we applied how we were going to manage our projects. It didn't necessarily mean that somebody had to be an expert to be the leader, or necessarily had to be an expert to be on the team. The different backgrounds and different skill sets would help us get better. And so this idea of being able, especially in the public sector, you don't know what's coming at you, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later, and you don't know where it's going to come from. There's black swan opportunities on a regular basis. And so we had to be flexible and nimble and adaptable and agile. And let me tell you, one of the first books that we studied when I became city managers that we studied was dealing with transformations. Let's see, managing transitions.
Managing transitions.
By Dr. Bridges, right? And so we had to introduce, because the city manager that had been in place had been with the city for 27 years and the city manager for, I think, 8. Right? And that institutional knowledge was gone. And people were used to, excuse me for saying it this way, how do we make sure we please Clay, right? I don't know how else to say it. So it was really centered around that. And so I wanted to make sure it didn't have anything to do with me. It had to do with our service to others. So we humbly serve our community, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But one of the things that we also talked about is along the way is and the ideal team player, humble, smart, and hungry. And how that applied to us. We are a learning organization. We are constantly in a learning mode. We invest, I don't know, I think I estimated close to 10% of our budget is in training. And, we have in our general fund, it may not be 10% now because of some issues, but our general fund is right around $62 or $63 million. And our overall budget's about $117 million. And we've got a little over 450 plus employees. And I will tell you, every one of those employees has permission and has the horsepower because of the training to do what they need to be able to do. And interestingly enough, it was important for me to go out and tell them that they have the horsepower and they have permission. So they wouldn't wait. I know that sounds a little bit, but it's the human character, right? Do I really have permission? Am I really prepared for it? And so what we always rooted ourselves into was, and we used Simon Sinek's why, that presentation he did on TED, as a basis of conversation. We are here to humbly serve the community that we work in. And in order to do that, we have to serve each other and take care of each other so that we can take care of the community. And so that is the mindset that we have. And every day we are communicating that message somehow, some way to our employees. So I think that concludes that slide, Peter. So if you want to go on to the next, unless there's some questions on that. Go ahead. Vicki.
All right, I'm up now. So I'm going to just build a little bit on some of the history that Mike talked about, because he did cover a pretty good part of the history of our culture. And as he mentioned, it's been over 20 years in the making, and I've been here for about 11 of those years. And when I got here, that was the time when we started really talking about how our culture needed to be built stronger throughout the organization. We were at a place where we wanted to identify the types of behaviors that we as an organization wanted to exhibit to the community. And so we started developing competencies that Mike mentioned earlier that have to do with technical, conceptual, and human. We started using those as part of a performance development plan for our employees. And that was kind of the foundation for me coming into the organization in terms of how we could make sure that we are actually nurturing that culture throughout the organization. But I also want to, before I go into the nurturing the culture bit, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other concepts that we garnered out of the numerous book readings that we've done, because we do book studies all the time. As Mike said, we're a learning organization. And one of the things that had a big impact on our organization was going through a process that is called the 6 questions out of this book called The Advantage. The 6 questions is something that kind of lets you sit down and talk about what you do as an organization, what your important things are and how you want to proceed. And it ultimately ends up with what's called a thematic goal. And that thematic goal is what you do as an organization for as long as you feel like it's necessary to achieve that thematic goal. And the first time that we did this was probably about, 5 years ago? 6 years?
It was 2012.
And the thematic goal that we landed on at that time was to live the culture. And that's because we were really at a point where we felt like we had a good foundation of the culture, and we wanted to be, as a leadership team, be the examples of what that culture should look like and make sure that it came to life in the organization. And so we did that. And it has made a huge difference in things that we've been able to accomplish, especially in the last 3 years or so, when we've been hit with some pretty interesting things that have happened in the city. And we'll get to that too. So along the way, nurturing the culture has been very, very important to us. And one of the ways that we've done that is through ongoing leadership development. We have a number of tools that we use that we offer to our employees to be able to develop personally in their leadership growth. One of them is called a personal leadership development class, and that's really geared toward the individual. And then we also have another process that we offer to employees, especially those who are in possible succession planning roles, where they might hopefully have an opportunity for leadership in terms of supervising and managing and ultimately being directors in the organization. And that's called SEED, and it stands for Succession Through Effective Executive Development, and that's organizational wide. So it's something that people can go through to really learn about what it means to be a leader and a director. And then we also do what we call an organizational needs inventory, which we've done over the past couple of years. We've done it twice. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it has had a major impact over the last few years on our ability to really get the culture that we believe in deeper down into the organization. Because one of the things that I think all organizations struggle with is really getting people down deeper in the organization to understand what that culture is, and that they have the permission and the ability to live that culture themselves. But it has to be expressed to them, and it's not something you can just say once. It has to be exhibited, and it has to be expressed to them on a regular basis. So the ONI, which is the Organizational Needs Inventory, it's a survey, And what that survey does is it gets input from employees about how they currently view the organization's structure and leadership and culture. It also asks them what their ideal view of those things are. So it results in a report that comes back and shows the gap between what their current view of the structure and leadership and culture are versus their ideal view of that. And that report can give us a tool on the kind of things that we need to do as an organization to reduce the gap. So we did this O&I, the first one in 2017, and we came up with 4 goals from that process, one of which is about encouraging employees to lead where they are. It doesn't matter whether they have a title in terms of a supervisor or manager. Anybody can be a leader in any role that they play. And the second goal has to do with focusing and developing their leadership. So one of the things we wanted to do was make sure that we are including, delegating, communicating with everybody in the organization to develop relationships, build trust, and encourage them to be leaders in the organization. The third goal is about committing to growth and change, and also creating opportunities to be able to respond quickly to organizational demands. And then the fourth goal is to provide an environment where the titles are not important. And we'll probably say that more than once in this conversation, that titles are not important. It's more about how people lead on their level. So when we did the survey in 2017, those were the four goals we came up with, and we decided to put together a group of employees to create action steps to achieve those goals and implement them throughout the organization. Excuse me. That team has been working on that for the past 2 years, and we decided to do another O&I in 2020. So that survey was done again this year, and it was really interesting to see what had happened during that time, during those 2 years. The gaps that had existed previously between the current view of our employees and the ideal view had reduced, which is what we had hoped would happen. But the thing that was interesting about that was that we did this survey during COVID, and it's a really challenging time to be doing a survey like this because everything in the organization had flipped. We had flipped from working in the office to working at home. We had flipped from providing direct service to our customers to being online just about for everything. All these different things had changed, but because of our culture, we were able to be very deliberate and intentional about communicating with people, making sure that they knew what was going on in the organization, that we were still encouraging the culture throughout. Everything, every decision that we've made is really surrounded or based on our culture. So doing this other survey, it proved that the human systems team was a good way for us to achieve the goals from the first survey. And it measured the progress between the 2017 and the 2020 goals. And it really has helped us move forward in terms of nurturing our culture in the organization. So how do we use the culture? Yes.
So basically you're saying that the second survey in 2020 was a performance evaluation on your work as a CMO team.
Well, I wouldn't say it was just our work as a CMO team. It's our work as an organization. Everybody was engaged in it. Leadership, managers, staff. The human systems team was made up of members of the organization throughout, from the front line all the way up to supervisors. And
how do they look at the results of the 2020 survey? Do they see it? Go ahead.
They're responsible for that, for those results, ultimately, because they're the ones that created the action plan and went out into the organization and started communicating with people what the culture meant to them and what the culture can do for the organization. And they helped with the communication throughout.
And so they saw it as a success?
Yes. And they're still working with us because we haven't stopped. These are things that will be continuing.
Okay. Excellent.
So the how do we use the culture to achieve results? I'm going to give a few examples, and And Mike and Tracy, if you want to chime in here, please do. But I'd like to start with the 2017. In 2017, we started preparing for a change in the property tax cap that was happening in our state, that the legislature had proposed a property tax cap, and that was going to impact cities in terms of their revenue. So we started preparing back then as to what we needed to do as an organization and how we were going to address any possible revenue reductions that were going to come along as a result of that cap. And as we got closer to 2019, we were faced with another potential revenue loss because of a legislative rule that has the potential to significantly impact our sales tax revenue. So now we have sales tax revenue being impacted as well as property tax being impacted. And that was a much bigger hit to our budget. We started preparing and organizing budget cuts to our general fund in the amount of about $12 million. And the thing that really stands out for me about that whole process was that nobody panicked about this. We talked about it. There was no edict, I want to call it. There was no edict on what each department had to go back and find money from. We weren't told what to cut and how to get those cuts to happen. Every department took their budgets, reviewed them pretty much line by line, and everyone came together as a team and talked about how we could reach this goal of reducing our general fund by $12 million. And it was just a fascinating process, I thought, because our culture really led up to this point in time where instead of looking at it with fear or doubt or any kind of hesitancy, people just stepped up to the plate and said, okay, what are we going to do to take care of this? And every single director, every single department participated in that. And we came up with a plan. And we were able to get to the point where we needed to be in terms of reducing our budget by that amount of dollars. And then COVID came. So we were hit with budget cuts, and we actually had to freeze positions, and we stopped doing some capital projects along the way. And then COVID came, and instead of, again, panicking, we put together our emergency response team, which we already had a plan for, but we put it together, brought people together, started communicating throughout the organization, communicating to the community. One of the things that we had to do as an organization was start to make some pretty quick changes to our policies regarding remote work, and also reacting to the government putting out some federal legislation about sick leave and employees who had children, and what we could do as an organization to accommodate those situations. So the culture really helped us get there. We've been working on it for a long time, and these things that happened in the last couple of years have enabled us to show that our work along the way has really paid off, because we came together and worked together as a group rather than panicking or excuse me, being unable to respond to these things very quickly. So, Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or Tracy?
There's so much to unpack in all that in terms of the culture.
I know. A
By
lot.
having the culture that we had in place, we made a statement from the very beginning that every decision we make, we are going to make through the lens of our culture and through the lens of our organization. I mean, that was up front. Then as we started to go through the process, when Vicki mentioned they didn't have any particular targets per department, we had targets as an organization. And I think when they came back together for the first time and they laid out everything and they saw that it added up, they were like, how in the heck did we do that? Mm-hmm. Right? Because there may not have been interaction between them at the time, but when they came around the table and they talked about what they were going to sacrifice and not do in their particular departments, and then when it all added up, I think there was a sense of accomplishment in a completely different way than just, we got through this. And then when COVID did come around, because we had already taken so much and put in place so much, COVID, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it was like, okay, well, what else can you bring on? Because at the end of the day, with COVID, we were in a position, unlike any of the other cities around us, we were in a position, we had already made decisions. And so, you know, in Colin's book, Great by Choice, he talks about luck, and he talks about planning, and he talks about, you know, doing the things necessary so that you can do your 20-mile march. Well, we were already on the march. And so when the cold weather came and the blizzard came, we just stuck to what we were doing because we had already had a plan and put it in place and moved through. So my point being in this is, and I know we got a lot more to cover, is that by using our culture and by having the kind of organization where we're constantly talking about these things, we're able to pull and say, this is why, or this is how this relates to our culture, or this is how it relates to an ideal team player, or this is how it relates to team of teams, or this is, so we're able to use specific examples along the way, and they can see how what we've been doing prepared us for what we're able to do now. And then therefore, they know that we're being prepared for the future. So there's a lot of confidence in the organization that we're just going to take care of business. And that's things, I guess, if anything, I'm most proud of is that, you know, we continue to offer words of encouragement to our organization, but they get it. And when people come from the outside and they see what we do, it's like, that they haven't experienced it before. They don't know what do you mean? You do what you say? Yes, we do. We do. You know, we live, eat, and breathe this. And the fact that it's the constant lens that we look through with everything, it just keeps us grounded. So that's how I'd close out on that.
Well, you talked about a conceptual competency or a set of conceptual competencies. It sounds like one of the conceptual competencies you have is a fluency in your own culture.
You know, I don't know that we've ever kind of couched it that way, but from a conceptual standpoint, we talk about being a learning organization. Mm-hmm. So the messages that we put out, we talk about thinking. And I don't know if this is the appropriate place or not, and I don't know where we are on time in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, Peter, but you know, one of the things we talked about is that with everything happening all around us all the time, especially at the leadership level, we have to take time to think, because if we're not doing the thinking, who is, right? Mm-hmm. And so what was it, about a month or so ago, I guess, mm-hmm. we literally shut the leadership down, the team down, and we had a facilitated, 4 or 5 hours of doing nothing but on an individual basis, having facilitation of going through and just our thinking processes. What are we thinking about? What's important to us personally and professionally? So it wasn't just about work. It's just, and to a T, every one of them that came out of that talked about how refreshing it was to take that time. And again, we had to demonstrate and build that time into our equation so that we've got the thinking going on. But we shared that with the rest of the organization that we were doing it. And this is what the fruits of it are. And by the way, there is an expectation that this leadership team that went through that is now going to go to you and lead you through that as well. So it's not something that's centered at the leadership team as far as, you know, the C-suite or anything along those lines. It's something we want to carry throughout the rest of the organization so that we can be better and smarter and do better.
And you had not had any face-to-face gathering like that for 6 months or so?
No, we haven't. And so one of the things that we did, March 13th, I mean, it's a day that'll leave in, you know, infamy for a different reason. But when the governor decided to shut things down, you know, we had to move and get ready. Since the beginning, we have about every 2 weeks, I have the equivalent of we call it Mike's Minute, where I am available in a town hall format for all our employees, and we hold it multiple times during the day and over multiple days. Every Monday, I put out a message, and every Friday, the three of us rotate and we put out a message. Then we have one of the things that we started doing is having individual meetings with individual employees, and started with the administrative assistants and meeting with them through Zoom on smaller groups. And so what we're doing is we're trying to get constant feedback all the time, but we're always being really upfront about this is where we are, and this is where we're going, and this is how we're going to get there. And here's, one of the constant messages, there's one coming out in about 10 minutes now, is that, when we put a date out in front, don't get married to that date. That's just a date for planning purposes, because I don't know when COVID's going to be over, but I do know that the more security I give you in terms of, okay, this is how we're going to operate between now and, let's say, the last one I did, I think, was back in September as far as the date, and I gave them January 1. So today I'm putting out the date through March 22nd. I said the only importance of that date is it's after spring break for the Coppell ISD. And so we're going to just plan accordingly to that. And so the whole point of all this is making sure that our employees are confident, that our employees are secure, so that they don't have to worry about their jobs. They don't have to worry about how we're managing. We're being consistent with the messaging that we're doing. So that was a long-winded answer to your question, Peter, but I mean, it has been a constant, conversation, a constant commitment to communication. And here's the other side of it. I don't know when we come out of COVID, but now this is the minimum bar now for how we're going to be doing business coming out of COVID, right? We're not going to go back. This is now the minimum bar about what's expected of me and of the leadership team as far as communication is concerned.
Mike, I had a question for you. I think this is awesome. And I also think about, I guess these will be my words, what a very difficult position you and your staff are in vis-a-vis your elected officials and sometimes wacky taxpayers that live in your community. How do you ensure the continued buy-in of your community to this that others could perceive? I could very easily see some scandalous paper wanting to skew the retreat you did and look at this boondoggle that Mike and the city leaders did in the time of a crisis, which I think was wonderful, but we're in such a polarized time. How do you keep that buying going?
So I will say this, again, you don't know Coppell very well. We are truly a bubble. We're 14 square miles. We don't have any room for growth, and we in a way kind of have our own walls. We're surrounded by interstate and tollways and the airport, right? So the community is really self-contained. Our council, through all this, we've had, and I think it gets touched on before, our community has bought into long-term planning. So we had a 2030 plan that was adopted in 2008 or 2009. It was capital oriented, and it was something that we worked towards. And I think when I finally put the report together, we probably spent about $170-something million in support of that plan. The whole way through, the community's buying into it. And then 2 years ago, we went through and even though we're in the middle of 2030, we adopted the 2040 plan. And the 2040 plan is more aspirational. And we had well over 1,000 plus members of our community participate in that. And so to your point is I have a council that has been extremely stable over time, very committed to the community and very long-term implications, the long view. Then 2040 comes out, the community starts talking about aspirational. The other thing about our community, it's highly educated. It's probably one of the most highly educated communities in the state, according to some report that we got not too long ago. And so from an education standpoint, again, we're just pumping information out all the time, Eric. I mean, it's just a matter of feeding information. And then the community's been very, very supportive for us. So when I say this, I hope I say this the right way. The council has made a goal that we will always be in the top third of our pay scale in the North Texas area. So from an education standpoint of our employees, I probably have a higher educated employee base than most because it's attracting that. And so the expectations, while you get to hear that from a lot of other communities, the expectations are through the absolute roof, right? And here's the deal, that's okay, because our employees understand what we're trying to accomplish and they don't fret over it. Most of them don't live here, but at the same time, they love what they do. Because if you choose, what we say, if you choose to work for the city of Coppell, that means you understand that you're choosing to humbly serve, and it's about someone else. It's not about you. So that's the kind of message. So to your point, Eric, we have Vicki can talk about it too. What is it, 2 years ago? 3 years ago? 2 years ago, allies?
3 years ago. Yeah, May I?
So Eric, so one of the things that we did is we said, okay, we're confident enough now in our culture, we're going to start sharing it with our community.
Mhm.
So to your point, we tell the community what we invest in our culture to serve. And
Mhm.
there are active partners with us through that conversation. So I don't know where that is in the spread, I mean, in the presentation, but Vicki can talk about that too. So I hope that gives you a good feel for where it comes from, right?
Tracy, could you talk a little bit more about the role of the Vision 2020 or 2030 and Vision 2040?
Yeah, and so this Mike did a really nice job of kind of folding that into the conversation, because I think otherwise the discussion of a strategic plan sounds like the odd man out in this whole discussion. But it's really the intersection where we have our internal organizational culture intersecting with our community. And so he talked about the idea about our commitment to long-term planning. And so we pretty much finished that 2030 plan. We took 10 years to implement a 20-year plan, which kind of led us into this new 2040 plan. And so we kind of took a different approach to that 2040 plan, and kind of applied some of the principles that we would normally apply internally for our employees, and really put that onto the process for our community. And so taking the belief that everybody's got value, that they can be leaders in their own right, and that they have something valuable to contribute to the process and understand what they want out of the community. City Council was very deliberate about staying out of the entire process so that it wasn't perceived to be, kind of a sham public engagement opportunity where we would invite people in and then council would just do what they wanted anyway. Same thing for the staff. We had very little to do with the actual inputs that went into the plan itself, and we just kind of facilitated places and where people were going to meet and those sorts of things. And it's really a scary thing when you throw the reins out to the community to say, this is your plan, and we're going to trust that you're going to provide kind of that long range vision for us. And they really rewarded our belief in them because we have a really terrific plan that is aspirational, that does look forward, and is forward thinking in terms of what they want the community to be. And so they articulated through that process that instead of building things, so 2030 was about building our capital environment. So parks and places to recreate and places to gather and all of those sorts of things. Now it's about how do we build the fabric with our neighbors, and how do we make people feel like they belong within this community. And so it's really, honestly, it's fortuitous that that's the focus, because some of the impacts that we've talked about earlier in the presentation about the budget and some of those other players in our ecosystem that we don't control, but that impact us, those changes really would have been detrimental to a capital intensive plan. Whereas now it's about focusing on building relationships. And so we have our very first annual work plan that's all built around implementing how we can build the fabric of our community. And I think that's more important than ever now, knowing that we've lived through 9 months of COVID disruption and individual isolation in terms of just what you can do and how you can interact with others. And I know Mike's going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how the community is walking through this pandemic as a whole, and kind of how we're experiencing them and some of the gaps where I think we can help them. But the plan itself really puts us in a great place to be able to respond for the future. Does that get it, what you're talking about, Peter?
I think it does. And one of the things we've talked about at different times in the roundtable is how we really need to weave the social fabric of the organization. And that's so critical to being able to get the work of the organization done. And Tracy, I love it when you say we had to just let go of it and let the citizens run with it. And that's scary stuff.
It is scary stuff, because typically that process would not have run that way. I mean, I've done a number of strategic plans in my professional life, and there's not been a single one in which we are just flies on the wall, and we really allow the community to drive every bit of what ends up in that plan, to our own frustration sometimes, where you're hearing things talked about and the community's like, well, wouldn't it be great if we did this? And we're sitting back there like, oh, we already are doing that, or what's in the plans, or, we're already, working with other people to make some of those things happen. And so it was a really interesting way to go about that. But I really think from a credibility standpoint for the plan on whether the community would support that, and then in turn, kind of empower council to do what needs to be done, because they have a high level of commitment to any of our strategic plans. I think it really lent itself to putting them in the strongest position possible when we start getting into implementation.
Vicki, could you talk a little bit about this humility and focus? We kind of went by that, but it's been a
Sure.
theme through your conversation here. So could you talk a little bit more directly to that?
I sure will. And
Wait, time, real quick, because the question got asked, how do you keep from getting too distracted by the moment and keep an eye on both? And if I don't know if this is related, then Paul, to the question about the plan, but there is a process in place for us to work with the council and then the staff. So we have the discipline that's been built over the years. So on these, in this case, the 2030 and now the aspirational, the council actually prioritizes, but they prioritize at a high level. And then we as staff then work together and basically work on, here's what the plan talks about, here's elements of the plan, and what can we do to support those elements of the plan that support the priorities. Then once that gets adopted, that didn't mean it's all, we have to be finished by this date. We have a full year, the next year, to work on those particular elements. So our focus is never taken away from working on the plan. That's how we were able to move so much stuff forward. But clearly the day-to-day, we got pinged today on something, but clearly the day-to-day, there's priorities that come up. But I hope, Paul, that answers your question about the process that we use to keep us on target.
Excellent. Good question, Paul. Thank you. So Vicki, could you talk humility and focus for us?
I sure will. So we alluded to it earlier that part of our culture centers around a set of competencies that we developed as a foundation for our performance development. And those competencies are technical, conceptual, and human. Humility is one of our key competencies. It applies for us to our desire to serve others. And the way that we define humility is here's the definition that we use. It's the noble choice to forego your status, to deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others beyond yourself. It's a willingness to hold power and service for others. So that's a key part of what we do in terms of serving with humility in the community. And as a part of that, it's really important that we hire the right people for the right jobs. And we call that getting the right people on the bus. But when Mike mentioned that we go through a hiring process, it's a pretty rigorous process, and we focus a lot on the human competencies going through those processes, because we feel like you can teach people the technical stuff, but you can't necessarily teach the behavioral. And that's what the human competencies are all about. So we also talk about this idea of not really getting hung up on our titles. I mean, I know people do get stuck on those sometimes, but the more we talk about the fact that we want you to think of us as your partners, your peers. We're here to get the work done, and it doesn't matter what the title is to get the work done. Our focus needs to be on how we're going to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish and why we're doing it. So those are the two, humility and focus are two of the things that we really try to spend time on.
All right. So Peter, I'll go back to when we talked about the advantage. We developed we call it the three anchors. And basically this goes to the permission and the horsepower. We've given you the tools, we've provided you the training, right? So you have permission. And in that permission, so what are the guides for that permission? So we've adopted these three anchors. And so every employee knows these three anchors. And in summary, what they say, and we don't get hung up on, do you say it the exact same way every time? But in summary, what they say is basically, am I exceeding the expectations of the person that I'm in service to? Am I making it better than I received it? So however it came to me, what did I do to make it better? And lastly, am I serving with a servant's heart, right? So if you answer those three questions in the affirmative ways that yes, these are the things that I'm going to do and how I'm going to do them and why I'm going to do them, you're not going to get in trouble. And we may screw up, right? but it's not because we weren't making the effort. And, you know, some people want to, maybe very few, it's that small percentage that maybe want to take advantage of that decision-making process, but you'll deal with them. The overall organization, those three anchors guide us every day in every decision that we make. See, that's the thing that we try to do. We try to keep it really straightforward and simple so that there's no confusion, right? And that goes back to when we first started this conversation about the three of us. While I sillily said, you know, the three musketeers, one for all and all for one, we all have to be on the same page. The three of us have to be on the same page in what we're communicating to the organization and what they're hearing from us. So it eliminates the confusion in the decision-making process. So that just relates back to, I'm here. This is what I tell them, and they know this. This is what I tell the employees when I go out. I have a pretty simple job. My job is to make sure that you've got the oxygen mask so that when you put it on, there's oxygen there, because without that, you can't go serve anybody else. My job is to take care of you. And in doing that, that means you can go take care of your fellow team members and our community. Now, there's more to my job. I get it. My responsibilities to the council, they're my first team. But my job is to take care of them as well, to make sure they always look good. Because when they look good, my life is much easier, let me tell you. But anyway, that's how we approach the organization. So when you look at when you look at the balance optimization model, you know, we talk about the individual, we talk about the organization, and we talk about the community. That's the societal, right? So all three of us have got to be working together at the end of the day. And that's what makes Coppell a community of choice. That's why people want to move here. You know, it's an amazing place, and it's a place that continues to be attractive. So Peter, I'll stop there.
Mike, did you see that question in the chat box there? I think that's a really great question from Larissa on culture.
Hold on, I'm not seeing it.
It says, what were the steps we took to build organizational capacity, allowing all employees to participate in this culture building effort?
Well, you know, let's go back to Vicki. And the reason I say that is because when Clay was here, so here's the institutional knowledge. When Clay is here back in the early 1990s, Clay came on as the fire chief. The city manager at the time was Jim Witt. Jim promoted Clay to be the deputy city manager and basically said to Clay, I need you to work on the culture of the organization because it's broken. And so there was a concerted effort at that point in time at the leadership table that they had to basically do things in such a way that they'll uninvite themselves to be at the table anymore, or they would be uninvited to take their talents into another location. Some chose to take their talents in other locations. And so that was the first thing that they had to do. Then we've been working with a group called the Management Connection since the late 1990s. And what that gave us is something that I think a lot of organizations would have value from, is that gave kind of a third party outside watcher, right? That was in communication with lots of different players in the organization. And there was trust in that whatever was being shared with that third party wasn't going to come back on them. Well, through that trust, the organization then started becoming this learning organization. So that's where it started. And then through the learning, then they started applying the learning. And that's when they got to the, you know, about 2008 when Vicki came on board, or 2009. I mean, it's just been a constant. There has not been a time since the early 1990s that culture is not dealt with every day in our organization, period. So when you ask that question, the employees, when they're hired in with the understanding that the culture is what's important here. And oh, by the way, we feed them all the time.
I'm coming to Coppell.
Well,
could I just add to that?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, some of the things that we've done in order to allow people to participate, a perfect example is the human systems team. You know, we've struggled over the last few years on how do we make sure that the message is getting down into the organization, because as you know, the message changes the deeper it goes. You start at the top and it changes a little bit every time somebody talks about it. So we needed to be able to get the message directly to some members of our staff who could take that directly to their peers. So frontline staff, you know, people that are out on the crews, or the people that are on the front desk, working every day with customers. how do we get them engaged in it to become what I might call an ambassador of culture? And so when we did the O&Is and we put together that human systems team, that's what their role was to kind of get down into the organization and talk to people and really share with them what they learned from the O&I process. So that's one way that we've made some inroads getting down into the organization deeper. We've also made inroads just because the personal leadership development that we do, we hope that someday everybody will have had an opportunity to take that class. It's about a 6-month class that people become part of. And it's an investment in their own personal leadership. And that they may end up leaving the organization, but that leadership class is going to stay with them when they leave. And they're going to take that to some other organization, and we'll have an influence on that organization just because of it. So we tried to do things that would include a lot of different people at different levels of the organization, so they have a say in how the culture gets communicated throughout the organization.
And I would also add on this question about hard to construct, I would counter that by saying you absolutely have to be purposeful in the construction of your culture, because you can't leave it to someone else to influence. That's why, I mean, we talk about it's so important that we get to our employees on the first day that they start, but we actually back up from there, that we're trying to imprint upon them on the culture in the hiring process.
Mm-hmm.
The sooner we can imprint upon them about what they're coming into, the easier it is to lay out those expectations. And so we have a methodical process that goes through that. And let me say this too, it's fun. It is not, we're not standing there lecturing them. We're not standing, we're having them live the culture every day in everything that they do. And when they're a new employee, it's part of the fun. It's the hedgehog bus. We take them around. We spend time with them. We've got bling for them, or what is it? Not bling. What is it?
Snacks.
Swag.
Swag. We got swag. Those kind of things. And we do feed them a lot. I'll keep coming back to that. And I will tell you just real quickly, and I know, again, knowing about time, one of the challenges we've had with COVID, which is killing us, is we can't get together. Mm-hmm. So we're coming up with all kinds of ways that we can somehow or another be together. And because we do eat a lot. I mean, we have, lots of celebrations for the employees. We have a Thanksgiving meal that we've done traditionally for a long time on the Monday before Thanksgiving, where all the employees come together and eat lunch together, right? So we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to do that? And so we came up with a way. We're getting ready to have our holiday, matter of fact, ours is next week, our holiday luncheons that the directors buy the main meal, and all the city takes care of like the rice and beans and those kind of things. But so we've figured out a way to do that so that there's still an opportunity to demonstrate togetherness, even though it's not the same way it was before, right? And we talk about that and we accommodate, because I've got, with fire departments, there are multiple days, multiple stations, police departments 24/7. So how do you do that? So we're learning that. So whenever we can start coming back together, there are still some things that we ought to do to keep doing, because those were the right things to do that we weren't doing before, right? To accommodate the needs of those employees. So I hope that helps you a little bit on the construction of it is a disciplined, it is a commitment to every day that we talk about it. We huddle every morning at 8:30 with all the directors, even though it may be for only 10 or 15 minutes, but it's just a quick catch up. Every Wednesday, we have our tactical meetings where we spend the morning and we talk about organizational issues. We get together every quarter at an offsite where we talk about the big pictures. And then twice a year, we get together in a 2 to 3 day retreat with just the directors to talk about the biggest of the big issues for the organization currently and looking forward. So this idea, it has to be worked on. It has to be disciplined, right? And you got to take all these inputs. So I'm going to go back to the model y'all worked on. The reason why it worked for us so well is because it put down, I don't know if you remember the Coppell's journey. Remember that document?
Yes.
If you want to share that with them after this is all over with, it just kind of gives how how we took the balance optimization model and applied, here's where these things fit. And you know what? If we identify a gap like the O&I, well, what are we going to do? And I think at the end of this presentation, we've already identified a gap with our community that we're struggling with to figure out what's next. Right? So Pete, go ahead, Peter.
Well, that's a great segue to one of the other questions that we just got.
Yes, it is.
Go for it.
So it says, any more you can say about how you've adapted during COVID in our interactions with the community members and how we serve?
Okay, I'll take that. One of the things that I did, or we did, see, I hate saying I, because it's not about I, it's about us. We're only successful because we've got a great team. But I started a quarterly call with the ministers. We don't have a ministerial alliance, but I've started a quarterly call with the ministers. And so here's where the real challenge comes in for Coppell. I mentioned earlier, Coppell is a fairly wealthy community, highly educated. Our Indian population, by the way, continues to grow. Southeastern Asian. It was in 2010, I think it was about 6%. Today, it's about 26 or 27%. By 2040, it's going to be about 40%, right? Our school district is predominantly from, our school district, the majority of students in our school district now are Indian or Southeastern Asian. So in talking with the churches, and I just had a call with them last week, and talking with the churches, what they're saying is their Coppell residents aren't really having a lot of financial needs. You know, a lot of them are in the tech industry and professionals, white collar and that type of thing. And so a lot of entrepreneurs and everything. So there's not a whole lot of pressure being, sent the church's way in our community. But they talk about the surrounding communities, how they're having to help some of the parishioners or some of their congregants, in the surrounding communities, which is they're more than happy to do. But what I've noticed is the last month or so, and this is what we talked about with them, is that things that were molehills were still molehills, but in the past, now we just bypass molehills and they're all mountains. Everybody's just weary, right? And so what I started connecting the dots and then talking to them about is that, as an organization, I mentioned to you about the level of communication we have. And my words of encouragement, hope, and here's what's next, and all those kind of things. But talking about goal setting already for 2021, what are you doing personally for that? What are we doing as an organization? But our residents aren't getting that kind of message. They're not getting the hopeful message. They're not getting the encouraging language, in terms of, circle of influence, for example. We hung for about the month of November. I really focused on being, what's your circle of influence? Be in control of that. Don't necessarily worry about anything outside that. So they're not getting that. And so this goes to the question that I think one of the questions we're going to mention is that we've got a gap, is now I'm pouring resources into help me talking to different people, help me understand what role we have in being that cheerleader, right? And so that, because we are sensing and experiencing what weren't that vitally important issue before, now all of a sudden it's the end of the world. I don't know how else to say it, right? And I don't make light of it. It's important to the individual and we treat them with respect, but it wears on your team, who is wary also, to have people fussing at them for some of the things that is like, really? I mean, there are a lot. I mean, y'all are listing, think of all the things going on in the world, and all of a sudden this is important. Literally, one of the things we got last week, I think it was last week, wasn't it? There was a skeleton that was put up against a Christmas tree. I don't go there and chase that weed. I'm just saying all of a sudden that became the most important thing because some people were upset. I thought it was Scrooge, but what did I know? So the person took it down and put up a Grinch. So that's how we solve that problem, as far as the individual, the humor. But my point being, last year, who would have cared, right? This year, they're all at home and they're seeing stuff, and now all of a sudden they're bothered by it. So when you ask the question about the community, how can we minister in the right way? So that's the question we're going through and have been going through probably for about the last 3 or 4 weeks. And as a result of a phone call yesterday, I found out something that I may be able to tap into that can help us. So anyway, we're working.
Now, one of the things that we discussed in our discussions over the last couple of weeks was that when you went to school to get your degrees in public administration, there was no discussion of the competency of ministering.
No,
And,
there's
and,
not.
and so now all of a sudden in the era of COVID, it appears that you should have taken a couple of courses in divinity and counseling in your public administration school.
Yeah. The psychology. Well, two things to that. One, they did, handling a pandemic last time was 1918. So I don't think any of us are around in terms of, and by the way, just as a little insight, our fire chief mentioned to us the other day that, in the emergency management plans across the country, they all have these kind of mass situations. There's a plan for the mass situation. Well, that one, you kind of had to throw it out the book. Now I'm going to make a political statement, okay? Because of the cluster at the federal level and the cluster at the state level, what we were having to deal with and still having to deal with is non-communication and not having a plan and not having a clue to what to do. So we're kind of on an island having to do our best with that. So that's my political comment. But when you talk about the other piece of it, when George Floyd was killed, the whole issue, think about, I'm going to use my generation and younger, right? My generation and younger hadn't really had to deal with this. And I'm talking about in this way. I mean, for those that are, I was talking to my uncle about this the other day. My uncle just turned 77. In the 70s, that age group, was right there when the civil rights, issues were going on, right? And so, but from my age younger, while racism and systemic racism and everything is a big issue, we never have to deal with it the way that the communities are having to deal with it now, right? And so, no, those weren't things in school that were talked about. It was how to balance the books and how to, debits and credits and those kind of things. And there aren't a whole lot of psychologists in my profession that went and got their psychology degree to become city managers or leaders in the profession. So, we're having to learn on the fly and learn really quickly. And this goes back to another point is that and it's not about, it's what you believe in, right? If you believe and have faith that you're in service to others, you're going to make morally, ethically, good, you're going to make good decisions, you hope, right? But you also have to portray, and I think you find in our profession, working with city councils, our profession is fairly unique in that we have the ability to directly influence every day the quality of life of every individual that lives in our community. From the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. When they drive down our streets, we're influencing the thought process that they have for that. Are they feeling good about their community as they drive down a solid looking street and a good looking community that's got all its lights working and the signs are good? And, when they get home, they got great parks to use. So we take it very seriously about the psychological impact of our profession and what we do. I'm talking about as an organization. And we talk about that. We use the example, I feel like I'm preaching, I'm sorry. We use the example that when our parks crews are out there working on the parks, they have no idea if some future, NFL athlete is going to be somebody who was on that park. And there are a baseball player. And in Coppell, Solomon Thomas, who plays for the San Francisco 49ers on the defensive line, went to Coppell. Kluber, who was a pitcher for baseball, went to Coppell. And so there's a direct connection. I can literally, I can say, here's a direct connection. Not everybody's going to be a pro sports player, but that level of care and concern makes a difference. And it could have that kind of influence on the future of that kid. In the same way, for example, Vicki talks about in the library, we have makerspace. They hold coding exercises for the kids and everything. They do those kind of things. And when we rebuilt our library, we called it Community Commons because it's a gathering space, right? So it's just all about the psychological approach that we took to the community and the community took to itself. To you answer your other question, Larissa, about what's the connection between us and the community. That's the expectations placed on us. And as long as we continue fulfilling those expectations, we've got a great relationship. Okay, that's my preaching for the day.
Let's bring some questions from the floor. Bert, you had a couple of good questions there. Raghu, you've thrown some in. What else would you like to ask?
Did I use a word PAE? Because I'm not sure what that is.
That was someone, I think that was Bob. There is a question here though that I think would be interesting to answer. And it says, it's about, has the organization of the organization changed as a consequence of the last 9 months? Have roles shifted?
You want me to take that one? Or y'all gonna take? Y'all take that. I'll sit back and just drink and just enjoy the show.
Well, I'll throw a few things out there and y'all can throw out some stuff too. So, one of the things that we've had to do just to adapt is that instead of everybody being in the building, we do have a lot of people working at home, but we also are doing rotating teams. So we have, for example, in our office, Tracy and I generally switch off being here every week. Our finance department has 2 teams where one team's in the office, the other's at home because there's certain things they have to do in the office. The library has 3 teams of people rotating in and out of the facility. That has made a huge difference on the way that they do conduct business. It's really, I know in the library that when they're in the building, all they do is work on circulation and customer service. They don't have time to prepare programs or do anything else. And they're still doing those things at home because we're doing a lot of virtual stuff, but they're not in the building. And that's, we also had a lot of crews that were doing the same thing initially. They were taking turns being in the city to do the work and being at home. So there has been a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the city as a result of COVID. Roles shifting, I'm not so sure that's been much of the case because people are still doing their jobs. We haven't laid off anyone. We just haven't filled positions in the organization. So I don't think that we've had a lot of shifting of roles, but that there has been change.
Yeah. And I guess what I would add to that is our expectation at this point, knowing that we had already kind of started planning from a financial standpoint of some of the changes that were coming at us from the legislature from 17, and then with our sales tax change this past November, we froze a lot of positions. And so what we've been asking our teams to do is when you've got a spot that becomes vacant for whatever reason, to really take a hard look at your operation. And is there a way to reorganize the work that you do? Does the work that person who's just vacated the premises, do we need to continue doing that job? Is that essential and a critical function to your department? Who else can be doing that work? How else can we organize? To your point, is there a different way to organize if we decide that we do need this function and this service, but maybe we don't need that person? And so we've asked our teams to go through that evaluation every time that there's an opening. And so we've had those conversations. And so in some instances, it does start looking a little bit different because they have come to the conclusion, okay, well, then these things need to change. And in some cases, it hasn't changed at all because we say, okay, well, we need a certified public accountant in this spot, and we have to have it based on these requirements for our audit, right? And so some of those are slam dunks. We must have them. And some of them, I feel like our organization is in a stronger position now because of those discussions that our teams have been having as those positions have come open. So it's been a little bit of a mix. So yeah, some of those roles have changed and some of them just based on the nature of them really haven't.
So this is an observation and maybe a question as well, but from the work I've done with organizations that have converted themselves to more virtual processes over the last 9 months, one of the differences I see is the coherence and strength of culture within organizations makes a huge difference in their ability to handle working virtually. And it sounds like you had a strength going into the whole COVID experience, which was going to force you back into more distributed virtual activity. You had a coherence, which many organizations don't have. But I'm still wondering, given all that, maybe you can tell us a bit more about if there's any real differences, not necessarily in the roles, but the way you've interacted with the community. For example, in healthcare, people have converted much more to telehealth. So doctors and nurses and all that are really providing service through more electronic communication and so forth. So have you come to rely more upon that as a way of communicating and interacting and serving people in the community who may have problems, say, with their permits or whatever it is, right? Because, you know, those are the kind of things that people in communities get concerned about from the city. Is my permit approved? You know.
Yeah, Tracy or Vicky, I mean, yeah, we have an answer for that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so there's many of our functions have been by necessity forced into a virtual environment. So you reference inspections. And so our building inspectors have been doing a lot of their residential inspections virtually. And so we'll call that person up on their phone and they'll say, okay, well, show me this. Okay, now show me that. And so things that we never, not that we would never have considered before, but would have been viewed as a lower level of service, because in our mind, that personal in-person service is where we want to be. So the virtual would have been viewed as a lesser and inferior service. And now I think, you know, we talked about what's the baseline moving forward. That's got to be an option moving forward, because some people are going to prefer, I don't want the hassle of somebody in my home. And it's frankly, it's probably easier for us because we can do those inspections from the truck. We could do them from the office. You know, our public safety teams pretty much have altered a lot of the ways that they do their interactions with the public. So, you know, before we would go into, you know, you called and you wanted to make a report, we'd go to your house, we'd sit in your living room, we'd write your report. Now, you know, none of that. We're taking that over the phone, or you're going to submit that. We're going to ask you to come out of your home, and we're going to stand far away from you and take your report. You know, we've got a lot of our administrative facilities have been closed to the public for maybe the bulk of this entire 9 months. And so while the building's closed, business has been going on. So if you need to pay your utility bill, can still do that online. Everything that you could have done in person, we've just kind of rotated that. And that's impacted some people, because for some folks, that monthly trip to the utility billing window to talk to Regina for 25 minutes, that was the highlight for that week. And that meant something to those individuals. And so those pieces were missing. And we don't have a way to replicate that necessarily right now. And we've had conversations, right? So in the future, do we just not open the utility billing window at all? What's the value of that interaction? And so those are some of the conversations that we've been having. But yeah, for sure, almost all of the things that we do that are public facing have been turned into some sort of virtual format.
One of the things I just want to mention is that fascinating to me is our court. Our court has had to go virtual in many, many cases. And it's been interesting because as a result of that, they've actually been more successful in getting people to take care of their business, because a lot of people don't want to come to court, but doing it virtually has been easier for them. So we've had more success in those areas. And some of the other things that we've been doing, like, for example, our senior center staff, the senior center has been closed the whole time, but our staff is reaching out to the members of the senior center so that they're not quite so isolated, that we're at least trying to connect with them. And we are also offering some virtual programs for seniors. So we're doing our best to reach out to people and stay connected. We are continuing with the Allies and Community program that Mike mentioned earlier. That's one of our efforts to share with the community our values and our culture. Typically, that is a very high touch, in-person sort of program, but we're doing it virtually. And I can tell you, it is a real challenge, because trying to get to know people virtually that you've never met before is difficult, but we're managing to do it. It's just, we're tweaking along the way to make sure that we are building those connections.
One of the highlights of that program is they share meals.
Yeah.
They
can't
do that right now. So out of the first 2 cohorts, that's all I heard about was about, we got to share these meals, and they fix this and this and this and this. And it's like, and they tell their stories too. They tell their stories of their family and everything like that. So it's not just about, so let me give you this. It's not just about us helping them understand our culture. We get to hear, because there are employees part of it as well, right? And so we get to hear about the backgrounds of the individuals and where they came from and what it was like back at home, and, you know, what's different for them here and what do they miss and those types of things. And, you know, I get to hear the stories related to me, and I'm amazed about some of the backgrounds of the folks that we have here. So anyway,
Vicki, it's great to see you again.
You
And
too.
excellent story.
Thank you.
I'm from Canada, so there's a lot of ignorance behind this question, but a lot of Texas communities have been ravaged by the COVID experience in terms of the pressures on their healthcare system and so forth. First question is, what is your experience in your community with respect to the prevalence of COVID cases? Is it much lower than the state average, or what is it?
I don't know. We're a community of 41,000, and the last number I saw, we have less than 800 cases, but that's since the very beginning, right? In terms of what's going on. In our community, I am only aware of one passing, and the person that passed was a nurse in the Dallas hospital.
Okay, so you're relatively low. I mean, in terms of an international, but you're not as low as some, but you're relatively low.
Yes.
To what extent of your, I don't know if you have healthcare facilities much in your community because you're relatively small size. You don't.
We do not have any hospitals. We've got a few emergency care kind of clinics, if you will, and we do have multiple doctors' offices here, but no, we have no, and we only have two kind of adult congregate care living type facilities.
But you have restaurants and the like, right?
Oh, yes, sir. Yeah.
So
We're
one
also-
of the stresses that North American communities have had is around how do restrictions get on interaction get applied in a way that is accepted within the community, and are you ever sort of reinforced somehow? What's your experience with all of that, and how does that relate to how you operate?
Well, the best thing I can tell you is that we have guidelines that the governor has said basically we can't enforce. And so it's voluntary compliance. And unless we're getting a complaint, we're not out policing people. I've got Tracy and Vicki, we've got maybe 2 or 3 employees that are even in environmental health at all, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and so it is not a priority for us to police our residents on whether or not they're doing what they're supposed to do. But we don't do things that promote, go back, use as an example. We built all these places for gathering. In this past year, we haven't been able to gather at all. We don't promote things that are counter to what the messaging is, right? So I hope that helps you in that.
Now, one thing that you ought to note is that your emergency medical technicians, EMTs, have a very high level of qualification. And so your ambulance service built into the organization is at a much higher level than most communities. Could you talk about that for just a minute?
Just a little bit. So our firefighters are also paramedics, so they serve as both. Our ambulance systems, we're connected to several hospitals, and we have a medical doctor who oversees our ambulance services. I don't know how else to describe this, but we probably have one of the highest rated paramedic teams in the state of Texas in terms of healthcare, to the point where people come to us to model, to see what we're doing, because we're at the point now where we're providing some emergency room care in our ambulances. So just, I know I'm saying that there's a lot that goes into that to get to that level of service. So, and I will tell you, the paramedics in the fire department, we've been really fortunate since COVID started. You correct me if I'm wrong. We've only had, it's been less than 5, I think, that probably in the paramedic fire department environment, and they're the ones that had the potential of the greatest exposure. But they've taken it really seriously in the way they've done their protocols, and there's some things that are going to come out of this as well that they will have changed as a result of the COVID protocols.
One thing I might add on the question of the enforcement and how did we approach that? I'll say at the beginning of the pandemic, I think there was an expectation that we were going to be the ones that were enforcing masks and enforcing social distancing, and there was not a lot of guidance that we were getting from the other levels of government above us. but I'll say, regardless really of what that direction was, the approach that we took really was consistent with our culture. And so it was more about educating. It was more about helping folks have resources to understand what was required. It was about knowing that while people could say, well, you have the ability to just give these folks a ticket, we knew that we have to, they live here and they work here, and we have to have an ongoing relationship with those folks. And that's not a way to create a positive relationship. And so a lot of our approach was, it was white gloved. It was soft. It wasn't coming in and, standing at the door of the grocery store and, writing off tickets for folks who are trying to get in without their mask and that sort of thing. And so that approach on the enforcement, it's kind of evolved over time just based on what the governor's mandated to us. But it's been a little bit different. I know there's a lot of communities that did start issuing tickets and did take a more enforcement focused approach, and that was tough. You probably read about them in the newspaper. It didn't play well with their communities.
Maybe you've already said this, but so I apologize if I'm asking for repetition. But in what very significant ways do you think the way you're organized has enabled you to provide service during COVID that you may not have been able to do otherwise?
Yeah, I don't know that I haven't thought of it from that perspective, because we were full on, what are we going to do to provide the level of service that we were providing, right? If I understand the question, it wasn't a question of what can't we do, it was a question of what can we do. And so therefore, how do we, when you ask about the organization, the way it was structured, the mentality of the organization was, okay, this is what we need to be able to do to provide this service. How are we going to get it done? I don't know how. I don't know, Tracy, go ahead.
Well, what I would add to that is we have a fairly distributed, so power is fairly distributed amongst the organization. And Mike talked about horsepower and he talked about permission. And so I think what has helped us in many ways adapt quickly and be flexible is the fact that out in the field, people have the ability to troubleshoot. They have the ability right then and there to come up with a process and a policy and a procedure for a new way of doing things without having to run it through our office and wait for us to try to give it the gold star and yes, you can do that, because that would have bogged down everything. And so people weren't waiting around for somebody to tell them, okay, yeah, you can do this, or yeah, you need to figure out a new way because we're not going into your house. I think that did contribute a little bit to just the flexibility and the speed at which we were able to walk through some of the things. Now, obviously, that not all of that occurred in a vacuum without somebody knowing what was occurring. Sure. But it didn't have to have some sort of bottleneck at a director level or at our level to say, get a green light before they made those changes.
So Tracy, from my perspective and looking at other organizations that have converted virtually, what you're saying is very, very significant. Because one of the keys I see in virtual organizations being able to operate effectively is their ability to handle and utilize distributed leadership, as opposed to everything having to be funneled through a few individuals. If you can have that semi-autonomous decision-making by people remotely, it really enables them to be much more able to handle these kind of situations in a virtual context.
Yep.
That's really important, I think, what you're saying.
Yeah, no, and it's been great because honestly, the brain power associated with trying to come up with a solution for everything that was happening, if that was reliant on the three of us trying to come up with that, we would have been in a terrible spot. We don't know what the ins and outs of the practical application of moving our finance team to a wholly different building because we were going to have voting in our building and thousands of people were going to be streaming in. Okay, well, they need to be moved to a different place because that's really not the safest place for y'all to be. All right, so y'all come up with a place and figure out what the processes are and how you're going to work that, and knowing that they're juggling two different rotating teams, and it was fine. It worked great. It was seamless. They had this whole control room set up in a conference room next door, and if they were waiting on us to come up with that solution, we'd still be we'd be in big trouble.
I'll give you another great example, and that's our fire department. They were looking for a way to sterilize their equipment. And they thought they would have to wait to order something and would take weeks to get there. So rather than doing that, they just came up with their own tool. They created their own tool and they went out and did it on their own. So there was nobody saying you can't do that, or do I have to have permission to do that? They just did it. And that's the kind of innovation that we're allowed to do as an organization. People are allowed to be innovative.
Yeah.
And
I got another question, but I don't want to take it over. I don't want to block anybody else ask a question, but it's more about, you said that your community is very involved in your planning process. Sounds like community members.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you talked about the ONI, which your organizational needs survey. To what extent do you have or value metrics from the community voice as to how they perceive level and quality of service?
Gosh, we've done community surveys every 2 or 3 years since the 1990s.
Yeah.
And let me talk through just a little bit about that, because there's 2 things about metrics. Internally to the organization, we have metrics, but I can tell you we are not, and we've had this great debate, but we are not a whole lot into metrics. And I mean that in terms of publishing dashboards and those kind of things. The attitude has been, if this is what the council tells us we're going to do, we're going to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's efficient in terms of keeping the numbers, right? That's our job to do that. But in the community survey, this last one that we did, now remember earlier I talked to you about the growth in the Indian population. So we have traditionally used the same questions over and over again for these 20+ years of doing the surveys. And so this year we used a different company, and Tracy, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So we had some basic questions that were the same repeat questions, and we asked some new questions. Forgetting this year and some of the troubles that we had and everything, but when we started getting the statistics back and we saw the report, we all it looked a little, something was off, and we couldn't quite figure out what it was. And we still had high scores for satisfactory and above satisfactory, or meets expectations or exceeds expectations. But the, let's call it satisfactory or just meets expectations number was larger. And I'm talking about 2 points. I mean, we're not talking, but it's still above 90, but it still got our attention. And so when we started drilling down into it, as far as the statistic, it was what we started finding out is the Southeastern Asian population was consistently just answering it as meets expectations or is satisfactory, whereas the Anglo population and everything was generally kind of consistent with what it was in the past. And what it told us through that as we go into the future is we have to do a better job of asking the questions to get clarification, because if the council just sees that, they'll see our scores lower, right? But that's not necessarily true. We have to understand the culture of the community that we're serving. And we may be doing just a phenomenal job, and they're just glad yeah, you're doing a phenomenal job. It's satisfactory, right? So when you ask that question about the community metrics, it's something that we keep and have been doing every 2 or 3 years, and we'll continue. I think the next one's in 22, I think, right? But we're going to have to pay more attention instead of the rotes asking the same questions over and over again, because the community has changed, and so now we have to change accordingly in terms of the questions that we ask. That help, Bert?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Bob, you had a question earlier. Do you want to throw that on the table?
Sure. Well, I live in a community of about 40,000, but I live in Minnesota on the border with Wisconsin, and so the governor has policies that the city has to follow. And as far as closing down restaurants and bars when your zip code gets a higher than a certain number of COVID infections. And so I, in the chat, I put a video in there. It's 23 minutes long, so don't try to watch it. But in there, it shows the complexity of, for example, us being on a border town, of city center people traveling between city centers. Mm-hmm. And then how it shows that the interaction of systems of cities and the crossing into those city centers causes unpredictable explosions in epidemic rates. That I sent this to some community leaders, and because I helped with a systems thinking thing a couple years ago, and also sent it to the local DJ or the fellow that comes out in the morning and interviews city managers. And I think I at least got him to go move beyond a yes, no type of question. Well, why are we closing and they're not closing over across the border? Or why were we doing this or why are we doing that? Not that they showed the video to the community, but I think it empowers community leaders to see how systems of different communities are interacting. And so anyway, I'll put that there, and I just wanted to, I'm enjoying the program and just wanted to throw that in there because oftentimes that, at least in my community, the policy, because we're a very conservative community, the policy was met with resistance the first time around, but not so much anymore.
So Bob, just real quick, from a regional standpoint, so we'll put R's and D's. Dallas is considered a D and Collin County is considered an R. They're butt up against each other. Dallas shut down, Collin County didn't. The judge was calling on the other counties to implore their help in getting control. And they basically said, thank you, but no thank you, right?
Right.
And so that's what I mean by the cluster of, with no leadership at the federal level and at the state level, you had local communities trying to fend for themselves, and in a pandemic, it just doesn't work. And we are split very smallly, but we are split into two counties, Coppell is. And one of the things I failed to say about Coppell and mindset too, I think it goes back to the bubble, but I think Peter would say this. When you drive into Coppell and when you leave Coppell, you've known you've gone into Coppell and you know you've left Coppell. It is the closest thing to a planned community without having a single developer. That's the best way to describe it. The look, feel, I mean, what we invest in just in signage and landscaping and lighting and you know, the things that we do in the community. Our motto is total best solution when you talk about different models, right? Ours is total best solution. And so to the mindset of the community, which kind of relates to the earlier questions, that is the expectation of the community. And so we do have to be in open communication with them and we do let them know what's going on. Are there people out there? Absolutely. There are people out there that are, you know, far to the right, let's just say, that, you know, kind of watch us and those kind of things. But they're generally a small group in our community, you know, and the mayor has been on the council since the late 2000s and mayor since 2012 or 11. And she is the president of Frost Bank. You can't get someone more conservative in terms of what's going on, but she does a great job communicating to the public. And she does a great job of leading the council, and you know, she lets them have their way as far as discussions and everything like that. But the council politically, when they make a decision, they walk away from the table. That was the decision, and I may individually not like it, but that's the decision we made, and that's where we're going, right? That's the kind of conversations they have. So they don't get into debates at the council dais in front of the public. They have their questions, they have their differences, but they treat each other with respect. And as a matter of fact, at the council level, we get together at least twice a year with them, and they always lead with, how are we doing? How do we communicate with each other? And what are the rules that we play by in a council meeting? That's how they lead their retreats before they even talk about business. So again, I think it goes back to being in a bubble. But
the last thing I'd say on the video, the last thing I'd say, you might like, because I think it fits into the complexities that you're doing, that you can put constraints or policies, but it's hard to contain all of the different variables. So you put in constraints on how ideas on what things can be done, but then you got to be willing to accept what emerges too.
That goes to the fishnet. Thank you, Bob. That goes back to the very first.
Could you guys talk a little bit about Judge Clay Jenkins and the role that he has come to play in your life?
Well, and when the pandemic first started, I was on the phone every day for about an hour with the judge, where he was talking through all the different edicts that were coming down from the feds and the state, and here he was trying to figure it out. He was a little bit on an island because through the declaration process, he's the chief elected official, and so he was saying, this is what we're doing, this is what we're shutting down, those kind of things, and he didn't necessarily have the county commissioners' support all the time. And I don't know, did it take about, Tracy or Vicki, did it take about a month or so before the county commissioners kind of started stepping up and saying, whoa, let's slow down a little bit? And they did. And then that's when the governor started stepping in and basically telling us that we didn't have any authority to do anything. So when you talk about in Texas earlier about the spikes, Bert, there's a direct relationship between our abilities to do anything and the mindset of the Texan, right? So Judge Jenkins hosts now, he hosts a Wednesday call and a Friday afternoon call. So he's reduced the number of calls down. And the midweek call, it's a little bit more serious right now just because we're exceeding the governor's target of 15% capacity in our hospitals. But the Friday calls are generally policy related calls about what's going on from a policy standpoint. And as an example, right now, starting to see a lot of information about the vaccine and how the vaccine is going to be distributed and what responsibilities we do or don't have and those kind of things. So he went into a mode of communication right off the bat with all the cities. So that was good. I will tell you the structure in Texas is tough, because not all counties have county administrators. There are probably, it's only in the urban counties, and the county administrators here, unlike, let's say in Colorado as an example, the county administrators here don't have a whole lot to do with the city managers. And I don't mean that negatively. I just mean they don't communicate with the city managers very often. So there was no relationship established before. There's no relationship now. It's really that chief elected official, Clay Jenkins, that has the relationship. Is that what you're looking for, Peter?
Yeah, and one of the things that illustrates is that every organization that exists in the context of an ecosystem, and you don't necessarily have control. Certainly, you may not even have influence, and yet you have to be able to adapt. And you illustrated it at least 2 times with the property tax cap and the sales tax adjustments. And then when COVID came along, you've got another layer of influence in the way that the governor says we can or can't do things, both to Clay Jenkins and to you guys.
Right.
And so for a while, Clay Jenkins had to be your focus. Now that's backed off a little bit. And yet he is still a significant influence and a resource to you guys. But a year ago, Clay Jenkins was not much of a factor. I mean, it's not, that wasn't, not to say disrespectful, but
right.
The circumstances put Clay in a position of being much more influential in the ecosystem, and probably favorably so. I've been favorably impressed with how he's been willing to step up, and particularly with the amount of communication that he's done with the small staff that he has.
Right.
And so he's probably been pretty helpful to the whole Dallas County crew as a result of his willing to bravely step forward, even when he gets slapped down by the governor. so the ecosystem matters. You know, it really does. Stu, and I hate to supply you with ammunition, but what I do want to say to you is that when they read the paper and we discussed the balance optimization model, it actually made sense to them. I don't know if you're shocked by that, but yeah, some of what we actually do actually works, it would seem. So
I want to make just a couple comments. I think when we first started off and Mike was talking about the organization becoming an agile organization and becoming a flexible organization. You know, it's interesting because in the work that we do, generally we think of the organizations that are moving more towards agility and more flexibility are in high technology, they're startups, they're organizations of that nature. And generally, I mean, in the past, you would think of a government organization of much more procedural, much more routine. And the realization is that that's not the case at all. The flexibility that's required for a government-based organization is huge because you have behavior and I mean, there's the virus, but there's also, you have, when we generally, most organizations, we talk about products that are being provided or some kind of routine service. But with the city that you have, the only thing that's going to drive consistency and it's going to drive predictability of service is going to be your culture. So it's very, very smart how you've figured out that culture is really going to be the key that gives you the flexibility that you need. When Good to Great, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote the book. I took a class from him at Stanford, but I can't even remember his name right now.
Jim Collins.
Yeah. And very interesting in at that point, Hewlett Packard and a number of organizations, they drove the whole corporation by what they call a 2x2. And on one axis, you had performance, financial performance, customer performance. And on the other axis, you had culture. And if you wanted to get promoted in an organization, that organization, particularly all the P&L managers, you had to score in the top right-hand box where your culture scores were high and your performance scores were high. Those managers who did extremely well in terms of performance, and we're talking about financial performance, return on investment, all those kind of hard numbers, but didn't do well in culture, were never promoted. And the point being, and this came out of Good to Great and also came out of all the basis of the Silicon Valley. The point being is that the relationship between culture and performance is intimately tied together. You know, you have to have both, you know, in order to succeed. And that's particularly true. And I found this presentation really, really good. I mean, it was very enlightening to hear how you guys have taken the culture and the way that you've done it, the investment in training, the investment in how you make decisions and all of that, to really provide great service to the community and be a flexible organization. So anyway, it's been a very enjoyable couple hours. Thank you.
If I could, just two things building on what Stu said, and I say this in response to some of the things you commented, Mike. I think what was very important, building on what Stu said about culture as your sort of focal catalyst, is that you saw you needed to institutionalize this. A lot of people don't go that second step. They just think about culture development, but culture needs to be institutionalized in order to have its power. And just another sort of sideline here, you made a comment about your training budget's about 10% of your operating budget, something like that. When I did a study of high participative organizations in North America about 15 years ago, I found that none of them were successful unless they invested at least 8% of their operating budget on what we'll call training and education. And for many people, that is very, very high.
Yeah.
But you don't get there unless you're prepared to invest in the developmental process. So you're on the, I hope you can use that as something of a reassurance that that what you're investing is actually very important.
I
Right off.
appreciate both of you. I'm smiling because Tracy, when she came on board and we were working through the budget the first time, right? Tracy, you remember those conversations?
I do. I do. Yeah. Bert, I came from an organization that the training consisted of what do you need in order to maintain your certification in order to keep your job.
Right, compliance.
And it didn't, that's all it was.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you come here and that there's all this, discretionary training, like stuff that you don't have to do in order to keep your job in kind of a traditional sense. And that we were committed to that. So even when things were tough in terms of budget, the things that got cut were not leadership development. It was not our work with the management connection. And all of those things, you kind of put your money where your mouth is if you say these things are important. And so, to the point somebody asked earlier about, politically, how do you keep your community supportive of those kind of expenditures, and how do you articulate that value? A lot of that starts with your council. And, I've worked for a community that would have never supported the kinds of development that we're doing here. But I think you see that in terms of what does the service look like then to your customers? How are they experiencing those employees and the service that they're being provided?
Right.
That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where it is.
I don't know if there's time for this, Peter, but I'll just make an observation that struck me. And then again, because I'm from Canada, I could be very much off base here. But in hearing the wonderful kind of, you've done some great things, and you're functioning in a very effective way. But what I'm also struck by is the simpatico, if you like, between your method of your approach as a city administration and the nature of your community. I live on an island. So you live in a bubble, Mike. I live on an island. But there's something very significant about that, because what I'm thinking about is the interaction between you as an administrative organization and the larger system that you serve, which is the community. And there has to be an effective kind of meeting of minds and interaction between those two. There's the larger system, and there, we talked about this optimization model.
Yeah.
I'm struck by two things. You have your community is very highly educated, you said. Also quite wealthy. Also quite diverse.
Yes.
You're also a bounded community. So in a sense, many communities keep thinking about, in a sense, your people have to live with each other. Like we have to live on this island where I live together. And we have horrendous political disputes on this island. But the one thing people love is the island. And it forces people to learn how to accommodate each other to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. So I'm hypothesizing that part of what makes your process and your approach work is because it's consistent with some of the characteristics of a larger system of which you are a part and that you're serving. But if you were dealing with a less educated, less diverse, and more scattered population, those may be factors that might, I'm hypothesizing, might make it harder for there to be the kind of sympathetic interaction between yourselves as an organization and the community that you're serving. I just wonder whether there's, I could be really off base here, but I'm struck by the nature of the larger system of which you're a part and serving.
would agree with you. It would be harder, but that doesn't mean it's not worth the effort.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. I know. Well,
And
I don't know if it would be harder, Mike, but I wonder, with it, if different, and Tracy talked about the group that she came from would never have made the investment that you have, whether the context within which she was operating was significantly different from the community context that you are operating with,
right.
in which in Coppell.
So Bert, I would say this to you too. In a way, it's also like discipleship. As people leave here, they take the culture with them and they try to replicate it where they go.
Yeah.
But they have to replicate it as it fits their community. You're exactly right. They can't do exactly what we did. You can't exactly repeat, what we did, because those attributes in that particular community may be completely different. But
Right.
the concepts are still valid, right? And the intent and at the end game, if you will, to get everybody going in that particular direction, it's still there, And as far as when I say humbly serve, if you choose to get in this profession, you have to understand that this is not about you. And we have that conversation with our employees. And that's not to take away from your value. And that's where I had to, my message, I had to early on when I came in. So here's a little confession. One of the things the previous city manager would say is, we only exist to serve the person in the house. Well, I had employees who would talk about that to say that, that seems to devalue me as an employee. That's not what that was intended. It was just the way it was heard, right? And so when I came on board, I had to quickly kind of address that issue and talk about the only way you get to serve that guy in the house is if you're taken care of. So you're my most important, person. And I have to take care of you. And I've got to make sure you have the resources. And I got to make sure you got the money in your pocket to put food on the table. And, I've got to make sure you go home safely every day. That's what I got to be able to do. And that allowed them reconnect with the idea, yeah, we are here to serve that guy in the house.
I've seen that whole approach work. So people who've gone through exactly that same shift of thinking that you're talking about,
right,
in a service organization.
Right.
You made the right shift.
Right. And that would apply to whatever the demographic is and the socioeconomic structure is, right? It is the mindset that it goes into. And I know we've been going a while, but one of the things that I've done too is we do book studies all the time. We took the Infinite Game and we did a book study with the council because I wanted them, because I got to prepare, because in May, I think I could have another change in my council. So by getting them in the routine of talking about the long term, when this new council comes on board, guess what book they're going to get? And guess what book study they're going to get? It's the idea is that's where I'm trying to influence them to have the long-term view so that they understand what that means, right? So we didn't say this, but the council, they are partners in this the whole way. So when you talk about private companies and their board of directors and those kind of things, right? I'm not going to tell you that we're not profit driven, because I can tell you a conservative council is always looking at every penny in terms of where we're spending and that tax rate, right?
Yeah.
But as partners, they understand the value of the staff. They understand the relationship between their success and how well we do our job, right? And because of that, they don't, I've been here since 2012. I have not heard, knock on wood yet, where there's any disparaging comment made about staff from a public official in this community. If anything, they're throwing flowers our way all the time. And do we always get things right? No, but I've really worked with them. There's always three sides to a coin. Just give us a chance to figure out, what's going on. And they buy into that, right? Because there's nothing really, you were talking about this earlier, and again, I'm sorry to take up your time. You go to bed, I go to bed every night with confidence that my team is doing exactly what they're supposed to do, right? And I talk to them about their representation of me. So I personalize that. But I promise you, and using the police as an example, it only takes one decision.
Yep.
And the whole equation could get turned upside down. But we as a culture, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to prepare with that? What's the decision-making process? And what are we going to do? We're going to fess up to it and we're going to own it. and we're not going to make an excuse for it, right? That's not what the council expects out of us when we screw up. But at the same time, I have just a tremendous amount of confidence in our staff. I do not lose sleep in my job, and I don't know many city managers that can say that, but I know I can, because I got a great team. I know that they'll take care of whatever business needs to be taken care of. So anyway, we've
What's
gone
in
way
it for
too
me?
long.
What's in it for me, Mike?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to sign out here, but I just want to make one last comment. I got a friend of mine, Robert, who lives in your community.
Oh, okay.
And I can't give you Robert's last name because I can't remember it right now. This is one of the problems you have when you get a little bit older. But Robert, I'm going to describe him, and you might know him. Robert flew for American Airlines in a big way. I mean, he flew to Tokyo and all that kind of stuff. He's got 4 cars. One of them is a 911, one of these very, very expensive 911 Porsches. And he drives down every year and a half with his wife from Texas to the house here.
Mm-hmm.
He stays with us at the house and goes to the concourse, where they bring all the exotic cars.
Right.
And so next time I see him, I'm going to tell him about you guys.
Hey, I'll tell you what, Stu, ask him first what he thinks of Coppell.
I will. I'll tell him that I listened to how the city is managed, and what does he feel about it? How does he feel about it? But anyway, so he's a very he's conservative. He's a very conservative guy, but on the other hand, he's got a liberal set of values. He's highly collaborative and he's a great guy. And anyway, so listen, I'm going to have to head on out, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Stu. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
Well, Mike and Tracy and Vicky, I have to say thank you so much for doing this and putting forth the effort. And thanks to Bert and Bob and everybody that's been here for joining in the conversation. I think it went very well, and I'm grateful for the good example that y'all are setting for public organizations everywhere.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for the
Our
opportunity
honor. Thank
to
you.
share our story.
Well, it's a great story, and we need to keep telling it over and over again. So Bert and Bob, thank you.
Thanks for hanging in.
Bert.
Thank you,
Bye,
guys.
Vicky.
Nice to talk to you again. Bye.
Y'all take care.
Hi, Mike.
Bye-bye. Y'all
I
take
will
care.
say, I'll say one more thing. I put a note in there about Waters Foundation and Friday Night DR. Just because you guys have a 20-year plan, you might really look at what it means to be a systems thinker in a K through 12 program. Because those folks will, if you grew up learning about what a systems thinker is, and I think you would find in there a language that could become a common denominator for your whole community. That
Sounds interesting.
I'm copying it now.
that everyone could share, because it talks about big picture, little picture. It's the language of a grade school curriculum that empowers the whole community to understand what it means to be a systems thinker. And that's what I tried to do in my community, but I don't know how far it will ever go. But it was the first time that I talked the Waters Foundation and the CEO for Friday Night at the ER to come to try to facilitate that idea. Friday Night at the ER is a game you play to break down the barriers that you thought the game was about.
Okay,
But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's cool.
But
good stuff.
there you
Thanks,
go.
Bob.
Yep.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Y'all take care. Tracy, Vicky, we'll get on a Zoom call right after this.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Y'all
Bye, you
take care.
guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Try to call you
Bye,
sometime.
Pete.
Okay, look
Bye,
forward to it,
Steve.
Bob. Bye-bye, Bert. Thanks. Michael, yeah.